After the French and Indian War, Britain was in major debt. As a result, Britain had decided to tax the colonists for the first time on March 22, 1765. Under the Stamp Act, anybody who used or purchased anything printed on paper had to buy a revenue stamp for it. The colonists were furious. They argued that they had no representation in the British Parliament, and therefore it was unfair to tax them. It was a bit hard for the colonists to have representation in the Parliament, though, since they were on the complete other side of the Atlantic. The colonists started to boycott and protest. Day by day, it seemed that the colonists would grow more and more angry. An example of a colonist who was angry with Britain was Patrick Henry, former governor of Virginia. He gave his infamous speech on March 23, 1775, called "Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death." He said that war with Britain was inevitable, and he wanted to convince others to fight back. He antagonized Britain for all of the hardships they had been through. Because of all the boycotts and protests, the Stamp Act was repealed. However, on March 18, 1776, Britain issued the Declaratory Act. Essentially, Britain said that we own you, and we can do whatever we want. This was obviously an assertion of power. As the British continued their effort to pay off their debt with taxing, they soon created the Townsend Act. With this, they wanted to not only gain power over the American colonies and make them pay for themselves, but they were specifically to pay for the salaries for the officials such as governors and judges. The Townsend Act included import tax on many of the British products brought by Americans, which included paper, lead, paint, glass, oil, and tea. The act also involved taking away some of the colonists' freedom, such as being forbidden to arrange a new court, and they had to give the right to officers to search their homes and businesses. The Townsend Act was passed by the British Parliament in 1767. Once again, seeing that they had no representation in the Parliament, the Americans saw it as an abuse of power which angered them, pushing them to the revolution. As a result, there were boycotts and protests, which soon became more violent. As the colonists continued to boycott, 4,000 British troops were sent and threatened the people of Boston. Even though the colonists continued to boycott, it was very hard for them since the Townsend Act taxed items that were widely used. Later on, the British would repeal all the taxes except for the tea. Since the British continued to have British troops due to the impulse order that was given in 1767, the Patriots continued to be angry, and this only increased the tension, which led to continuous skirmishes and scuffles. Then, on March 5, 1770, a group of angered patriots started to heckle a British guard, and this only encouraged more people to come and join them, which soon turned into an angry mob. Although additional British troops came to support the guards, the patriots continued on to throw things at them, and they started with rocks and more hurtful objects. As tensions arose, shots were fired without the captain's command. This caused the death of 5 of the American colonists, one of which was Crispus Attucks. After the intense fight, 6 of the British soldiers who shot the colonists were free, while 2 were found guilty of manslaughter. John Adams was the defendant for the British soldiers. Soon after the Boston Massacre, in the year of 1772, a British revenue schooner in Rhode Island was burned by colonists living there. Word about the Boston Massacre soon spread among the 13 colonies, which caused more anger among the colonists. In 1773, Britain tried to import untaxed tea to the East India Company. The Americans held a ship in Boston and didn't allow them to unload the tea. On December 16, 1773, with the intention of ruining the tea, a band of patriots who were known as the Sons of Liberty disguised themselves as Native Americans and marched down to Boston Harbor. They boarded the British merchant ship. They threw nearly 10,000 pounds worth of tea overboard in front of thousands of spectators. Their action became known as the Boston Tea Party. In 1774, the British punished Massachusetts for it. The British closed down their General Assembly. They revoked or put an end to their charter and sent 3,000 more troops to occupy the city. Essentially, Massachusetts was under the direct rule of Great Britain.
After the Boston Tea Party, the British government decided to discipline the rebellious colonists in Massachusetts. With their decision made in the spring of 1774, the Parliament passed a series of laws known as the Coercive or Intolerable Acts, which involved the closing of the Boston Harbor until the restoration of the destroyed tea was paid. It also replaced the colony's elected council with one arranged by the British, gave extensive powers to the British military Governor-General Thomas Gage, and forbade all of the town meetings unless they had approval by Britain. Yet there was another provision that protected the British colonial officials who were charged with capital offenses from being tried in Massachusetts. Instead, they were being sent to another colony or to Great Britain for trial. Even worse was the Quartering Act, which allowed British military officials to accommodate unoccupied houses and buildings in towns. Even though Britain placed their own royal governor to take charge of the Massachusetts, people still set up their own provincial congress. Since Britain was in control of Boston, but the Americans had control over the countryside, the colonists began organizing and training their military. On September 5, 1774, 56 delegates from 12 out of the 13 colonies gathered and met in the Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia. The only colony that didn't come was Georgia. Georgia didn't come because at the time they were fighting with the Native Americans and relied on Britain for military supplies. Paine Randolph from the colony of Virginia was the first president of the First Continental Congress. The question was specifically how to deal with the British. Joseph Galloway of Pennsylvania proposed a plan that suggested the creation of an American Parliament, which would work along with the British Parliament. Galloway's plan was defeated on October 22, 1774. In the end, they affirmed their loyalty to Britain, but decided to send a letter to King George III explaining to them the issues they were dealing with, and asking the king to get rid of the intolerable acts. The letter told the king to get rid of taxes and royal governors, stop British Parliament with controlling American affairs, that there should be no British troops in peacetime, and that they were cool with the trade regulations. However, Britain clearly wasn't happy with this, since their response was more troops sent to America and more restrictions. And in 1775, Massachusetts was declared to be a state of rebellion. In 1775, British Commander Thomas Gage was ordered to disarm the rebels and arrest their leaders in Massachusetts. On April 18, 1775, a member of the Sons of Liberty, Joseph Warren, learned from a source what British Commander Thomas Gage had been ordered to do. Warren sent Paul Revere and William Dawes to alert the residents of the news. This is where Paul Revere's ride came from. Paul Revere often spied on the British and had participated in the Boston Tea Party. It was planned that Revere and Dawes would go by separate routes in case one of them was caught. Paul Revere and William Dawes rode into the night ahead of the Redcoats to warn the leaders in Lexington and Concord. The two met up in Lexington, where they met Samuel Adams and John Hancock. The two then persuaded them to flee and then set out again. They also met Samuel Prescott, a third rider, who made it to Concord. Revere was later captured by a British patrol. Dawes was thrown from his horse, which made it so that he was forced to go to Lexington on foot. On the dawn of April 19, 1775, about 700 British troops made it to Lexington. There, 777 militia were waiting. Then a shot rang out. Nobody knows which side had fired first to this day, before order could be restored. Several shots were fired by the British. Later, it would be found that 8 militiamen were killed, while 9 militiamen were wounded. Only 1 British soldier was injured. The militiamen had fallen back to Concord. The British continued to search for arms now into Concord, not realizing that the vast majority had already been relocated and that 500 militiamen had been waiting for them. The Redcoats burned what little they could find. Militiamen went over to Concord's North Bridge and noticed that the British soldiers were defending it. The British fired and then the colonists fired back. The British were soon overwhelmed and chased away. The British then prepared to return to Boston, located 18 miles away. However, around the area, 2,000 Minutemen were waiting. They fought, but the British were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Soon, British troops were abandoning weapons and clothing to retreat faster. At the end, as many as 3,500 militiamen firing constantly killed or wounded roughly 250 redcoats, compared to about 90 killed and wounded on their side. This is where the war had begun. On May 28, news of the battle would soon spread to London.
The Second Continental Congress took place on May 10, 1775 in Philadelphia. On June 14, 1775, about a month after it reconvened, it created a united fighting force, the Continental Army, naming George Washington the new commander-in-chief. The 13 colonies started expelling the royal governors and started taking control. Adding on July 5th, the Congress authorized the Olive Branch Petition, a final attempt at negotiation. However, the next day, the Continental Congress issued the Declaration of the Causes and necessity of taking up arms. This explained and justified the 13 colonies going to war. The Second Continental Congress assumed the normal functions of a government, appointing ambassadors, issuing paper currency, raising the Continental Army through conscription, and appointing generals to lead the army. The Battle of Bunker Hill. On June 16, 1775, the colonists had learned that the British were planning to send troops from Boston to take over the surrounding hills. Under American colonel William Prescott, 1,000 militia men built fortifications on top of Breed's Hill, overlooking Boston and located on the Charlestown Peninsula. The next day, on June 17, 1775, about 2,200 British forces under William Howell and Brigadier General Robert Pigott landed on the Charlestown Peninsula and marched to Breed's Hill. First, the Americans threw the British into retreat, then the British attacked again and retreated again. Prescott was getting low on ammo, yet when his forces went up to Bunker Hill for the third time, the Americans were forced to retreat. The British had won the Battle of Bunker Hill. Though it is called the Battle of Bunker Hill, most of the fight occurred on Breed's Hill. Despite the loss, the inexperienced colonists inflicted significant casualties against the enemy, which boosted their confidence. 3 weeks later, on July 2, 1775, George Washington would arrive in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and take over the colonial army. Proclamation of Rebellion. On August 23, 1775, in the Proclamation of Rebellion, the King of England declared elements of the American colonies in a state of, quote, open and avowed rebellion, end quote. It ordered officials of the British Empire to use their uttermost endeavors to withstand and suppress such rebellion. Soon the British were recruiting from Boston, Ireland, and even Hessian mercenaries from the Roman Empire. Siege of Boston. After the battles of Lexington and Concord, Boston was being besieged from April 19, 1775 to March 17, 1776 by American militia men. George Washington arrived onto the siege of Boston to take charge. The colonial army was undisciplined, ill-equipped, yet they somehow managed to make the siege last through the autumn and winter. The Continental Army tried to press into Quebec, which was being controlled by the British because they wanted the French Canadians on their side. However, the plan failed. By March 1776, George Washington gathered cannons which were placed on the hills overlooking Boston. The British then evacuated into Halifax in Nova Scotia. George Washington did not want the British because they would make a great naval base. As a result, Washington moved the colonial army to New York City so they would defend it. In June 1776, General Howells landed near George Washington on Staten Island. Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine was an important figure in the American Revolution. He was a political activist, author, theorist, and philosopher. In January 9, 1776, he published Common Sense, which advocated independence from Great Britain. He also would later support the French Revolution in the 1790s. He was imprisoned in France in 1793 and famously criticized Christianity. The call for independence. Many Americans came to realize that their military might not be capable of defending the British Empire on its own. Meanwhile, the war itself evoked hostility towards Britain, among the citizenry paving the way for independence. In the spring of 1776, the provisional colonial governments began to send new instructions to their congressional delegates, and in one way or another allowing them to vote for independence. However, the provisional government of Virginia wanted to go further. Virginia instructed its delegation to submit a proposal for independence before Congress. On June 7th, Virginia delegate Richard Henry Lee followed the instructions. Congress postponed a final vote on the proposal until July 1st, but appointed a committee consisting of 5 men to draft a provisional declaration of independence for use if there were enough votes for independence. The committee consisted of 5 men, including John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, but the declaration was primarily the work of Thomas Jefferson.
The Declaration of Independence. The Continental Congress made several revisions to Jefferson's draft, but on July 4th, 1776, in Independence Hall in Philadelphia, Congress voted to approve the Declaration of Independence. It was written between June 11th and July 4th, 1776, and it declared the 13 colonies as independent from Britain. Thomas Jefferson penned on eloquent defense of the natural rights of people and stated the reasons the British colonies of North America were seeking independence. However, the Declaration of Independence was only meant for the white men. August 1776. General Howe's forces were ready to attack Washington. British forces flanked the American forces, which caused Washington's forces to be drawn out of New York. This was a win for Britain. Washington's forces managed to escape through New Jersey, through the Delaware River to Pennsylvania. However, General Howe chose not to follow. As the British drew closer, Congress fled from Philadelphia. General Howe spread his forces all across New Jersey. George Washington decided to attack before the end of winter. On the night of December 25th, 1776, on Christmas, George Washington stealthily crossed the river Delaware and ambushed 1,000 Hessian mercenaries at the Battle of Trenton. 1777. Since the Americans were winning, General Howe decided to concede most of New Jersey to Washington. It was remarkable because, although they were outnumbered, illy prepared, and not well trained, they were somehow winning. Militia continued to attack small British forces. The British force under General Burgoyne pushed down from Quebec to try to cut off New England from the other colonies through 1777. However, they were stopped at Saratoga, New York by Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold's forces. The problem was that Burgoyne had hoped for help from Howe. However, Howe had sailed his forces south to take Philadelphia. Because of Burgoyne's mistake, he had to surrender. However, Howe was more successful. He outmaneuvered Washington and captured Philadelphia. This was bad for Washington because he had to spend the winter in Valley Forge, where many died of disease and cold. Some of his soldiers were even losing hope in him. Thankfully for Washington, Howe sent his resignation and didn't attack Washington. 1778. During 1778, France declared their allegiance with America because they wanted revenge against British and didn't want Britain to grow more powerful. Without France, America probably would have lost the American Revolution. The Carlisle Peace Commission, 1778. The British offered the Americans a chance to go back to the old days, but America didn't want any part of it because they wanted independence. In the seas, Britain had superior fleet. Since Howe had resigned, Henry Clinton took over and became the new British commander-in-chief. As the French Navy approached, Clinton moved his forces up to New York. Britain was now using Native Americans and armed them so they could fight against colonists. 1779. As a As a result, in 1779, George Washington ordered the Sullivan expedition. He ordered the burning down of Iroquois Confederation, loyalist crops and villages. The Iroquois Confederation was a Native American political and military alliance. Later on, Spain allied with the Americans. Britain had started to remove soldiers from America. During 1779, the war in the North was slowing down. As a result, the British started looking to the South. Clinton left New York to try to get stronger foothold in the South and more support from the Loyalists down there. As winter approached, the situation for Washington's Northern Continental Army got worse in the North. The unbearable freezing weather was breaking apart the Continental Army, and money became worthless.
Because of the harsh weather condition the Continental Army had faced during the winter of 1779, during 1780, some mutinies broke out in the Continental Army. Luckily, the militia was able to contain them and hold back British advance that tried to take advantage of the situation. By May 17, Clinton was able to capture Charleston, South Carolina, and most of the South Continental Army. He then returned to New York, leaving Lord Cornwallis in charge of the South British Army. Up north, the British landed some troops in Rhode Island, but the British Navy stopped any further French landing. On the other hand, Benedict Arnold had been growing increasingly disillusioned with the American Revolution and defected to the British side. Cornwallis Gates took over the remaining American Continental Army in the South and was defeated in the Battle of Cannon. As a result, the British took back control of South and North Carolina. In 1781, Cornwallis continued to push through North Carolina, but his force was worn down by countless battles with the newly appointed General Nathaniel Greene. Cornwallis decided to retreat his force to Wilmington, North Carolina, leaving Georgia and South Carolina. By the end of September 1781, the British only controlled Savannah and Charleston. Cornwallis decided to continue his force north into Virginia, where he set up a base on the peninsula. The French fleet then moved in and fought off the British fleet, cutting off Cornwallis by sea. The combined American and French force under General Washington and Comte de Rompy had cut off the British on both land and sea. Cornwallis ultimately surrendered his force as a result on October 9, 1781. British reinforcement was sent out around the same time from New York, but it was too late. The news reached Britain the following month. The king, however, wanted to continue the war fighting against France, Spain, Dutch, and America. By 1782, Prime Minister Lord North resigned and the power went to the Liberal Whig Party that recognized America's independence and ended the war. By 1783, the Peace Treaty of Paris was agreed and Britain signed over land to the United States. The land included Native American land west of the Appalachian Mountain, unknown to the Native American. France, on the other hand, had bankrupted itself, paying for the war leading to its future French Revolution in 1789. America in the following decade would reorganize itself to the America we know today.